Hello there, I'm Katie Cooper, and welcome to my Contemporary Feminist Theory final project presentation. In this presentation, we're going to be going over an explanation of 5 different approaches to contemporary feminist theory, an application of those approaches to a modern policy, as well as an assessment of the approach that I find most compelling and useful. So to start, let's explain the 5 approaches. We'll start with sameness, using sources from Haslinger and Hackett, as well as Sojourner Truth. So the sameness approach to sexist suppression holds that since women and men are similar in all relevant ways, women ought to be treated as men are treated. This approach advocates for fairness of treatment based on characteristics. If a man receives particular treatment because of his certain characteristics, then a woman likewise ought to receive comparable treatment on account of her similar characteristics. This sameness approach is exhibited by Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Sojourner Truth was an abolitionist and women's rights activist who criticized men who believe that women, quote, can't have as much rights as men, and instead argues for the granting of equal rights to women. She backs up her argument with personal anecdotes about her strength and endurance being equally matched, if not exceeding, a man's. Sojourner Truth's Aren't I a Woman speech exhibits the sameness approach to sexist suppression by expressing her, and by extension women's, similarity to men in terms of capabilities and experience. Using statements of ability like, quote, I have plowed and planted and no man could head me, and I could work as much and eat as much as a man and bear the lash as well, Truth emphasizes characteristics she embodies that are comparable to those of men, exhibiting the first guiding premise of the sameness argument, which is, women share similar C to men. She then accomplishes the final premise, women ought to receive comparable chi treatment to men, by employing a metaphor of a woman's cup that ought to be filled equal to a man's. Quote, if my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? This emphasizes her belief in a comparable T treatment for women based on their similar C characteristics to men. Next, we'll be explaining the difference approach using Iris Young's writings on gynocentrism. The difference approach to sexist suppression proposes that women are entitled to be treated as well as men, not on account of the two groups' similarities, but rather due to the societally beneficial, quote, distinctive value of womanhood. In this conception, it is the essential difference between men and women that bolsters women's deservedness of improved treatment, as women uniquely contribute to society through their nurturing, peaceful, connected, and ethical nature, starkly contrasting with the competitive and often harm-inciting masculinist values of a patriarchal society. This difference approach is exhibited in Iris Young's Humanism, Gynocentrism, and Feminist Politics. Young denounces the humanist feminist, or sameness feminist, revolt against femininity, with an opposing gynocentric feminist perspective that sees femininity not as confining or an oppressive status to overcome, but rather as a uniquely beneficial quality of womanhood that ought to be valued by society. She conceives of femininity as a distinctly, quote, women's nature that ought to be equally valued in a masculinist, individualist, patriarchal society because it offers a more nurturing, understanding, and ethical approach. Young's writing exemplifies the difference approach to sexist suppression by arguing for the improved societal value of traditionally female activity as opposed to the disruptive, quote, male-centered values currently favored by society. Rather than categorizing femininity as a weakness or a source of oppression, the gynocentric feminist recognizes the, quote, specifically feminine virtues that allow for a woman's unique, positive contributions in areas of peace, moral rationality, anti-military advocacy, and more. Women ought to be treated equally, then, not on account of their similarities to men, but instead as a result of these uniquely beneficial contributions that women offer to society. Our next approach is the dominance approach, which will tie into Catherine McKinnon's essay, Difference and Dominance. The dominance approach to sexist suppression argues that sex discrimination results from patriarchal socio-political norms that enforce, quote, the subordination of women to men. This subordination perpetuates oppressive male control over women's social, emotional, and physical lives that must be toppled in order to grant women the physical security, self-expression, individuation that they have been denied on the basis of being born women. In Difference and Dominance, Catherine McKinnon explains her perspective that to achieve equality is to grant women access to everything we have been excluded from, as a result of the dominating societal power men enforce over women. She, unlike the sameness and difference feminists, is not concerned with the characteristics of women that should earn them equal treatment, but instead points to the very existence of sexist inequalities of the world as what entitles women to improved treatment. McKinnon therefore embodies the dominance approach by focusing her argument not around women's qualities in relation to men, but rather to do with male society's harmful and systemic relegation of women to a condition of inferiority in social, political, domestic, and other spheres. She believes it is this dominating imbalance of power itself that entitles women to receive, quote, equal power in social life, as the male-enforced, socially situated subjection of women is long-running and unjust. The next approach is postmodern feminism, which will tie again into Hackett and Haslinger, as well as Barker and Scheele's queer-graphic history. Postmodern feminism rejects the idea of shared universal conceptions of experiences like womanhood or sexist oppression, and instead proposes that feminists should acknowledge that these experiences take different forms in different contexts, periods, and cultures. Since there is no objective, universally shared truth in regards to issues or experiences feminists discuss, theorists must consider historically and culturally specific narratives and contexts in order to effectively critique social systems and offer remedies that are not one-size-fits-all. This postmodernism approach can be easily tied to the post-structuralist approach outlined by Scheele and Barker in their book Queer: A Graphic History. Scheele and Barker summarize the post-structuralist preference to reject the existence of a single universal absolute truth, so as to not purport the false notion that grand narratives can explain all of human existence. Instead, post-structuralism renders illogical attempts to access universal knowledge or a single true meaning, as it sees knowledge as inherently partial and contextual, dependent on personal contexts and, quote, power relations between people. This post-structuralism exemplifies postmodern feminism by similarly rejecting the notion of shared universal truths. Postmodern feminism mirrors the post-structuralist affinity for accepting multiple, even contradictory interpretations of texts, experiences, and concepts by adopting the stance that there's no single, universally true way to experience concepts like womanhood or sexist oppression. Rather, knowledge, what one believes is true, regarding such ideas is contingent on systems of power. Such knowledge must therefore be diverse and flexible because power systems like patriarchy and institutionalized racism affect different individuals in very different ways. The final approach to explain is identity politics, which will reference the work of the Combahee River Collective. Identity politics comprises political mobilization of a group of people around a significant identity that they all share. It supposes that the personal is political, and thus political advocacy is effective and meaningful when performed by a group of people with shared cultural and experiential notions of oppression that guide their advocacy goals. The Combahee River Collective, a Black feminist group, utilizes identity politics as the driving force for their feminist theory and advocacy, with the idea that the most profound and potentially radical politics results from focusing on our own oppression as women and racial minorities. They acknowledge that neither the women's movement nor the civil rights movement have specifically focused on the Black female experience, leaving Black feminists as, quote, the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for their own liberation. The Combahee River Collective perfectly exhibits identity politics because the group sees collective identity as the powerful driving force in their fight against oppression. In their 1977 Black feminist statement, the group outlined that organizing around shared identity allows feminists to look more deeply into our own experiences and fight against oppression specific to us, a strategy not possible in the absence of such powerful coalescence around shared identity. Furthermore, the CRC embodies identity politics with the recognition that political advocacy against oppression is built through a consciousness raising about the commonality of our experiences as intersectionally oppressed individuals, another clear marker of the importance of their identity to their advocacy. Now that we understand the 5 approaches, let's turn our focus to a contemporary topic reported on by Higher Ed Drive and The College Fix. The 2024 decision for historically women St. Mary's College to reverse their former trans-inclusive admissions policy. In June of last year, historically women's Catholic college St. Mary's in Indiana amended their undergraduate admissions policy to accept applicants whose, quote, sex is female or who consistently live and identify as women. This inclusive change marked the college's joining of 27 of its fellow historically women's colleges across the U.S. who all practiced trans-inclusive admission. Indeed, the decision left only 2 women's colleges, Nebraska's College of St. Mary and Virginia's Sweetbriar College, remaining without gender-inclusive admissions policies. However, the policy soon faced intense pushback from some members of the St. Mary's community, with the campus bishop Kevin Rhodes insisting that the change promotes ideology that is, quote, at odds with Catholic teaching. Sure enough, within the semester, the Board of Trustees voted to reverse the policy. In a letter that December, they stated that although we believed this policy affirmed our identity as an inclusive Catholic women's college, it is increasingly clear that the position we took is not shared by all members of our community. Upon that reverse decision, the college continues to be one of only 3 women's colleges in the U.S. that refuses to consider transgender women for admission. The movement to convince the St. Mary's College Board of Trustees to reinstate their trans-inclusive admissions policy should be considered a feminist issue because it argues for the societal equality of an oppressed group, particularly an oppressed subset of women. The end goal of this movement is to reinstate an inclusive policy that allows for students who identify as trans women to enjoy the same educational and equitable societal opportunities as their cisgendered peers. I would advocate for the reinstatement of this college's trans-inclusive admissions policy by organizing a letter of support to be sent to the St. Mary's College Board of Trustees from transgender student leaders across many American historically women's colleges. In the letter, the student leaders would voice support for the reinstatement of the institutional policy to admit transgender women. The following section details what the letter writer's arguments in favor of trans-inclusive admission could look like under our 5 different theoretical approaches. A sameness approach would emphasize the similarities between trans and cisgender students to ultimately argue that these 2 groups deserve equal consideration in admissions. This letter might read something like, transgender female applicants to your college are similar in all significant ways to cisgender applicants. They want to pay money to attend your school, study to earn a degree, and be a contributing member of a community that accepts them. As such, they ought to be treated with the same equal considerations as cisgender applicants. The option to be admitted and to attend the college. On the other side, a difference approach would highlight the unique value trans students would offer to the campus community to encourage the Board of Trustees to give them equal treatment in admissions. This letter could read, transgender applicants ought to be treated with the same equal considerations as cisgender applicants, not on account of the group's similarities, but rather because trans students contribute uniquely beneficial virtues to your campus community. Trans students can offer past experiences, diverse perspectives, and a unique expression of feminine virtues that will ultimately serve the campus by encouraging other students to lead with inclusivity and an openness to hearing new, different, and beneficial perspectives. Moving on, a dominance approach would call on the college to admit trans students on account of the historical injustices and power imbalances those students have endured in a transphobic society. This letter could say, transgender applicants ought to be considered not on the basis of their characteristics in relation to cis students, but rather as a correction of the injustices trans people, particularly trans women, have long faced in a transphobic society. The cisgender majority exerts harmful dominance over trans people by limiting their personal and professional freedoms. To correct this unjust distribution of power, trans students ought to be given the same opportunities for admission as those who identify as cisgender. Next, a postmodern feminist approach would involve highlighting the impossibility of any objective knowledge that claims to know of indisputable reasons why trans students should not be admitted on the basis of gender identity. This letter could say, critics of inclusive admissions policies claim to have the objective, quote, knowledge that trans women are not women and thus should not be logically admitted to historically women's colleges. However, knowledge is instead a subjective, malleable concept informed by power structures and how they affect different individuals. It is thus necessary to consider that someone with different experiences of oppression, for example, a young transgender student, could possess contradictory, though no less true, knowledge that trans women are women and thus ought to be considered for admission. Finally, an identity politics approach would urge the importance of the advocacy for trans-inclusive admissions policies to be conducted by trans students themselves, as the shared identity of this group will drive their fight against oppressive policies. This letter could read, consciousness raising around trans women's experiences with both transphobia and sexism can act as a powerful catalyst for anti-oppression advocacy. In the absence of strong societal acceptance of trans women's identities, it is the experience and perspectives of trans women themselves that have the power and insight to promote political change such as this proposed change in policy. Thus, we write to you as transgender students ourselves to encourage you to reinstate your inclusive admissions policy that will grant trans women like us equal treatment and consideration to attend your institution. Lastly, let's move on to assessing the approach that we find most compelling and useful, which for me was identity politics. As a reminder, identity politics comprises the political mobilization of a group of people around a shared significant identity. Followers of identity politics believe that the personal is political, and thus they encourage people with shared cultural and experiential notions of oppression to collaborate on political advocacy for maximum outcome. As I said, I find this approach to be the most compelling. In prioritizing community gathering around shared identities, the identity politics approach most aligns with what I've always interpreted advocacy, including feminist advocacy, to be about: people with shared motivations working together toward collective goals. To identity politics subscribers like the Combahee River Collective, these shared motivations are influenced by the commonality of experiences that, when recognized, is an effective catalyst for political coalition building. I find this conception of what motivates groups of people to fight oppression strong in both its logic and specificity. It makes sense that with, quote, growing consciousness of shared community experiences, particularly negative experiences under oppressive power structures, a group of people are equipped with the emotional motivations, cooperative skills, and vision for a more positive future that are all needed to engage in effective political advocacy work. In this manner, the identity politics approach has logical merit. Additionally, I appreciate this approach's focus on specific instances of oppression that need to be overcome in order to build a more positive and just future. Groups like the CRC seem to have very tangible, narrowed visions for how they want to see oppression combated. They recognize the specific goal of using their intersectional positionality as Black women to combat oppression against, quote, racial and sexual castes. In tying itself so closely to the personal experiences with individual forms of oppression, identity politics has a distinct ability to focus its efforts on specific forms of oppression in order to productively work towards a more positive future. The usefulness and efficiency of identity politics can be seen at many levels, including national, local, and personal. At the national level, in the wake of many federal policies restricting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, nonprofit National Women's Law Center is pushing back by issuing lawsuits against the federal government and representing women in court, particularly in cases of domestic violence and sexual assault. This organization's legal advocacy is directed towards women and carried out by women, rendering it emblematic of the identity politics approach. Narrowing down the scale, a local example of the effectiveness of identity politics-driven advocacy is the recent work of Decatur, Georgia's Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights in throwing their 5th annual Pan-African Festival. This local festival pushes back against the marginalization of African identities in gentrified areas by encouraging celebratory bonding over African music, food, and dance. This example illustrates how the coalescing of the local community around shared African identities can push back against stigmas and combat marginalization. Finally, I've seen the effectiveness of identity politics in my own work on the Agnes Scott Student Government Association. As Commuter Student Council President, I've collaborated with fellow members of SGA to draft legislation for a meal swipe donation system to be implemented on campus. Under this system, resident students with unused weekly leftover meal swipes can donate meals to commuter students who don't have or can't afford meal plans. This is a personal example of how I've collaborated with other members of a community I am in to advocate for our identity-based needs and develop a creative solution. Due to its logical merit and its ability to tackle specific forms of oppression, identity politics is to me the most compelling and useful approach at the national, local, and even personal scales. That brings us to the end of the presentation. The textual sources referenced can be found throughout the slides, and here are the images cited. Thank you so much!